Welcome back to Mr. Caleb Stories. Tell us where you're watching from and the time there. Rain moved across Dallas in steady sheets, turning the hospital driveway into a mirror of flashing red and blue lights. The emergency entrance of Baylor Medical Center stayed bright against the storm. Nurses moved in and out with stretchers. Ambulances rolled forward one after another. But tonight, something else had drawn attention. A long black luxury car waited beneath the entrance canopy. Cameras surrounded it. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their microphones pointed toward the back door of the vehicle. Inside that car sat a man who rarely appeared in public without global attention. Mateus Carvalho, a Portuguese billionaire known across Europe and the United States for energy projects, tech investments, and quiet philanthropic work. His visit to Texas had already filled business news for 2 days. Now every camera outside the hospital waited for him to step out. Security guards formed a tight line near the vehicle, scanning the crowd while rain soaked their jackets. Across the street, a woman stood beneath a broken bus shelter. Her coat was thin. Water dripped from her braids. Her hands trembled as she watched the hospital entrance through the rain. Her name was Amara Johnson. Most people passing by saw only another woman who had spent too many nights sleeping on sidewalks. But tonight, Amara stepped off the curb. She moved toward the hospital entrance, toward the crowd, toward the black car. At first, no one noticed her crossing the street. Then one reporter turned. Another camera shifted. Amara reached the edge of the entrance lights. She took 2 more steps. Her knees suddenly weakened. And before anyone understood what was happening, she collapsed hard onto the wet concrete just a few feet from the billionaire's car. Cameras swung in every direction. Security rushed forward. The storm kept falling, and one moment had just changed everything. Have you ever seen someone's life change in a single moment? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe for more American storytelling. For a second, the entire hospital entrance froze. Rain kept hitting the pavement. Camera lights kept flashing, but every person standing beneath the entrance canopy stared at the woman lying on the concrete. Amara Johnson did not move. One of the reporters lowered his microphone slowly. Did she just collapse? Another camera operator stepped closer, trying to focus through the rain. Security reacted first. 2 guards ran toward her, pushing through the circle of reporters. One of them knelt beside her, checking her pulse while the other waved toward the hospital doors. Medical team, now! Inside the emergency entrance, nurses immediately rushed forward with a stretcher. The moment that had been planned as a quiet arrival for Mateus Carvalho turned into sudden confusion. Inside the black car, the billionaire watched through the tinted glass. Mateus Carvalho had seen crisis before. Billion-dollar negotiations, high-risk ventures across continents. Pressure never frightened him, but the sight outside the car pulled his attention instantly. A woman lying in the rain, alone, weak. Security tried to block the cameras as the nurses lifted Amara onto the stretcher. Water dripped from her coat onto the hospital floor as they pushed her inside. The reporters began shouting questions. Is she connected to Mr. Carvalho? Did she come here for him? Was this planned? The guards refused to answer. Inside the car, Mateus leaned forward slightly, watching the hospital doors close behind the stretcher. Something about the moment did not feel random, because just before Amara collapsed, she had been looking directly at his car, not at the reporters, not at the hospital, at him, and that single detail raised a question no one outside understood yet. Why was a woman from the streets trying to reach a billionaire? Inside the emergency wing, the doors burst open as nurses pushed the stretcher down the hallway. Rainwater dripped from Amara Johnson's coat onto the polished hospital floor. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. One nurse checked her pulse while another called out instructions. Possible dehydration, severe exhaustion, get fluids ready. The bright hallway lights reflected across the metal rails of the stretcher as it moved quickly toward an examination room. Behind them, the sliding entrance doors closed again, sealing off the storm outside. Back beneath the hospital canopy, the tension continued to grow. Reporters crowded closer around the black luxury vehicle. Camera flashes bounced across the rain-soaked pavement. Security tightened their positions. Everyone stepped back, one guard ordered firmly. But the questions kept coming. Did she know Mr. Carvalho? Was she trying to speak with him? Why collapse here tonight? Inside the vehicle, Mateus Carvalho remained still. His sharp eyes stayed fixed on the hospital entrance. He had arrived in Dallas only 48 hours earlier for a major energy project announcement. Meetings with investors, government officials, corporate partners. None of those plans included this moment. Yet the image replayed in his mind. The way the woman had stepped into the light, the way her eyes had searched the crowd, and the way she had been looking at his car just before she fell. Mateus slowly opened the car door. The reporters reacted instantly. Cameras lifted. Microphones moved forward. But Mateus ignored the noise. His attention stayed on the hospital doors where the stretcher had disappeared. One quiet thought crossed his mind. This woman had not come here by accident. And if that was true, one question mattered more than anything else. How did she know him? The rain continued falling across the hospital driveway as Mateus Carvalho stepped out of the car. Camera flashes erupted instantly. Reporters surged forward, calling his name. "Mr. Carvalho, sir, was that woman trying to reach you? Do you know her?" Security quickly moved to form a barrier between the billionaire and the growing crowd. Mateus barely acknowledged the noise. His attention stayed fixed on the hospital entrance, where the stretcher had disappeared minutes earlier. He adjusted the cuffs of his dark coat, rain striking the fabric as he walked toward the doors. The guards followed closely behind him. "Sir," one of them said quietly, "we should proceed inside. The press is getting aggressive." Mateus nodded once. The hospital doors slid open. Warm air replaced the cold rain as he stepped into the emergency lobby. The sound of the storm faded behind him. Inside, nurses moved between stations while patients waited along the walls. One of the reception staff recognized him immediately. "Mr. Carvalho," she said carefully, surprised by the sudden visit. Mateus spoke calmly. "A woman was brought in moments ago. She collapsed outside." The nurse checked her screen quickly. "Yes, sir. She's being examined right now." Mateus paused. "Is she conscious?" "Not yet." For a moment he stood there in silence, processing the strange turn of events. Outside, reporters still filled the entrance. Inside, the hospital continued its normal rhythm. Yet the night no longer felt ordinary, because somewhere in the building, a woman who had crossed a storm to reach him was lying in a hospital room. And Mateus still did not understand why. The billionaire turned toward the hallway where the medical team had taken her. His next decision would change both of their lives. Mateus Carvalho stood in the quiet hospital hallway, watching as a nurse disappeared through the door of the examination room where Amara Johnson had been taken. The sounds of the emergency wing continued around him. Phones rang at the nurses' station. Footsteps echoed across the tile floors. Doctors moved between rooms with calm efficiency. Yet Mateus remained still. Outside, the reporters kept shouting questions beneath the rain. Inside, he was left with one thought he could not ignore. Why had she come here? A security guard approached him carefully. "Sir, the press outside is growing. Your team recommends leaving through the private exit." Mateus did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once more toward the closed examination room door. Moments earlier, he had never seen this woman before. Yet something about the way she had crossed the street through the storm, the way she had searched the crowd, the way her eyes had locked on his car, none of it felt random. "Find out her name," Mateus finally said. The guard nodded and moved toward the nurse's station. A few minutes later he returned. "Her name is Amara Johnson," the guard said quietly. No identification was found on her when she arrived. Mateus repeated the name in his mind. Amara Johnson. A woman from the streets of Dallas had walked through a storm, collapsed outside a hospital filled with cameras, and somehow seemed determined to reach him. But the reason remained unknown. Mateus turned and began walking slowly down the hallway. What he did not realize yet was this. 6 months earlier, their lives had already crossed once before. Neither of them had understood the meaning of that moment at the time. But everything that happened tonight began there. 6 months earlier. On a quiet street in Dallas, Texas 6 months earlier, morning arrived slowly beneath the wide concrete overpasses of downtown Dallas. Traffic thundered overhead, while early sunlight slipped between the highway beams. Beneath that shadowed space, small clusters of people stirred from sleep. Cardboard mats folded away. Blankets rolled tightly into plastic bags. Among them sat Amara Johnson, Her back rested against a concrete pillar. A worn backpack lay beside her. The zipper had been repaired several times with small metal clips. Amara rubbed her hands together against the morning chill. Another night outside had passed. Across the open space beneath the bridge, a few others gathered their belongings quietly. No one spoke much at this hour. Most people living there had learned to move without drawing attention. Amara stood and stretched slowly. Her clothes were clean, though clearly worn. She took care of that. Every evening she washed what she could at a nearby shelter sink before returning to the overpass. Dignity mattered to her. Even when everything else had been lost, she opened her backpack and removed a small notebook. The cover had faded from years of use. Inside were pages filled with neat handwriting. Lists, numbers, notes, plans that had once belonged to a very different life. Amara studied one page for a moment before closing the book again. Above her, the Dallas skyline caught the rising sunlight. Glass towers reflected gold across the distance. Those buildings once represented opportunity. Now they felt like a separate world entirely. Amara lifted her backpack onto her shoulder. Another day waited. Another search for small work. Another attempt to survive. And somewhere deep inside her mind lived a quiet truth she rarely spoke aloud. She had not always lived under a highway. By mid-morning, the sidewalks near downtown Dallas began to fill with movement. Office workers crossed intersections with coffee cups in hand. City buses released passengers along Main Street. Construction crews prepared equipment near half-finished buildings. Amara Johnson walked along the edge of the street, her backpack resting against one shoulder. She moved with purpose. Every day followed a simple routine. Search for work. Even small tasks mattered. Outside a small grocery store, a delivery truck had just arrived. Boxes stacked near the entrance waited to be moved inside. Amara approached carefully. "Excuse me," she said to the driver. "Do you need help unloading?" The man looked at her for a moment, unsure. "Pay isn't much," he replied. "Just a few dollars and maybe some food." "That's enough," Amara answered. For the next hour, she carried boxes from the truck to the storage room behind the store. The work was heavy, but she did it without complaint. The driver handed her a small bill and a bag with 2 sandwiches. "Thank you," he said. Amara nodded gratefully. Small jobs like this kept her moving. Later that afternoon, she stopped near a public library where a community aid van had parked along the curb. Volunteers handed out hygiene kits and water bottles. Amara accepted one politely. She never pushed to the front of the line. Patience had become part of her survival. As the sun lowered behind the tall buildings of Dallas, she found a quiet bench overlooking a stretch of the city skyline. She opened her backpack again. The worn notebook appeared in her hands. Her eyes studied the numbers written on one page. Columns, calculations, carefully written plans. The kind of notes someone might see in a business office rather than on a park bench. Amara closed the notebook slowly. Because few people around her knew the truth. She understood far more about business than anyone expected. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the sidewalks of downtown Dallas as Amara Johnson walked toward a community shelter near Elm Street. The building sat between 2 older brick warehouses. A simple sign near the entrance read Community Outreach Center. Inside, volunteers prepared evening meals for anyone who needed them. Amara stepped through the doors quietly. Warm air replaced the dusty heat of the street. The smell of soup and fresh bread filled the room. A few people were already seated at long tables. Some spoke in low voices. Others simply rested in silence. Amara took a tray and joined the line. One of the volunteers smiled at her. "Good to see you again, Amara." "Thank you," she replied gently. She accepted a bowl of soup and a slice of bread before moving toward an empty seat near the corner of the room. Even in difficult circumstances, she kept a quiet sense of dignity about her. Her posture remained straight. Her speech stayed calm. She ate slowly. Across the table, an older woman studied her with curiosity. "You're not like most people who come through here," the woman said softly. Amara paused. "What do you mean?" "You carry yourself like someone who once had a different life." Amara gave a small smile but did not answer directly. The woman nodded as if she understood the silence. After finishing her meal, Amara thanked the volunteers and stepped back outside into the evening air. The sun had begun to sink behind the Dallas skyline. Golden light reflected across the glass towers far above the streets. Amara watched those buildings for a long moment. A memory passed through her mind. Conference rooms, business plans, late nights reviewing numbers. For a brief second, the past felt close enough to touch. Then a passing car horn pulled her attention back to the present. And the streets welcomed her again. Night settled slowly over downtown Dallas. Traffic lights glowed against the darkening sky, while cars moved steadily along the streets. Restaurants filled with evening customers. Music drifted from open doorways. For Amara Johnson, night meant returning to the overpass. She walked beneath the wide concrete bridge where several people had already begun setting up for the night. Some arranged cardboard sheets. Others leaned against pillars, speaking quietly. Amara found her usual place near the far edge of the structure. The ground there stayed slightly drier when rain fell. She removed her backpack and sat down, stretching her tired legs. The sounds of the city echoed above them as vehicles passed along the highway. A young man nearby struggled to light a small portable stove. Amara noticed and reached into her bag. "Here," she said, offering him a lighter she had kept for emergencies. He smiled gratefully. "Thanks." She nodded and returned to her place against the concrete pillar. Moments later, she opened her backpack once again. The small notebook appeared in her hands. This time, she turned to a different page. Sketches, rough building outlines, notes about space usage, numbers written beside measurements. Her fingers traced one line carefully. A housing design. Simple, affordable units built close together to reduce costs. A place where people living on the streets could rebuild their lives with dignity. Amara closed the notebook slowly. Even now, when survival filled most of her days, her mind still worked through ideas like this. The dream had never disappeared. It had only been delayed. High above the overpass, the lights of Dallas towers shone against the night sky. Amara looked toward them. Because deep inside, she knew something many people would never guess. She once worked inside buildings like those. The night air beneath the Dallas overpass grew cooler as the city settled into darkness. Most of the people around Amara Johnson had already laid down for sleep. The quiet hum of traffic overhead blended with distant sirens and the occasional passing train. Amara remained awake. Her back rested against the concrete pillar, while her eyes stayed fixed on the skyline in the distance. Even from here, the towers of downtown Dallas stood tall against the night sky. Their windows glowed with the light of offices where people still worked late into the evening. Places she once understood well. Amara slowly opened her backpack again and removed the worn notebook. She flipped to the first pages this time. Unlike the rough sketches and calculations deeper inside, these pages contained something different. Professional notes, meeting outlines, strategic ideas written in clear, confident handwriting. At the top of one page sat a heading, Urban Housing Development Proposal. Amara studied the page quietly. Her fingers rested over several lines of detailed financial estimates. Construction costs, long-term returns, investment strategies, the kind of planning normally discussed inside corporate boardrooms, not beneath a highway bridge. Footsteps nearby pulled her attention away from the notebook. A man walked past, carrying a blanket, barely noticing her. Amara closed the notebook again and placed it carefully back into her backpack. Few people knew the truth about her past. Once, she had helped design housing projects meant to improve struggling neighborhoods. Once, she had sat across from investors explaining why smart development could change communities. Then everything in her life collapsed faster than she ever expected. Now, she slept beneath highways, but one quiet truth remained. Amara Johnson had never stopped thinking like a builder. And soon, someone in Dallas was about to notice. Morning sunlight stretched across downtown Dallas as a line of black vehicles rolled slowly toward the K. Bailey Hutchison Convention Center. Police escorts cleared the streets ahead. Media vans waited along the entrance road, their satellite dishes already raised toward the sky. Today's event had drawn unusual attention. Executives from major energy companies had flown into Texas overnight. Government officials arrived in dark vehicles. Investors gathered near the main entrance while security staff checked credentials. The reason stood inside the center of the motorcade. Mateus Carvalho, the Portuguese billionaire, had built his reputation across Europe through massive infrastructure projects, solar energy grids, coastal wind systems, transportation networks connecting major cities. Now his company planned its largest American investment, Texas. The project involved energy distribution, construction development, and new infrastructure across several counties. Inside the lead vehicle, Mateus reviewed a digital report on his tablet. His dark suit remained perfectly pressed despite the long flight from Lisbon the night before. Beside him sat Rafael Duarte, his operations director. "The media interest is higher than expected," Rafael said, glancing at his phone. "Several national outlets arrived this morning." Mateus looked out the window toward the approaching convention center. Large banners hung along the entrance. "Texas Energy and Infrastructure Summit." "We expected attention," Mateus replied calmly. "This project will affect thousands of jobs." Outside, cameras prepared for the arrival. Reporters stood behind security barriers, adjusting microphones while watching the motorcade approach. The long black vehicles slowed as they reached the convention entrance. Doors opened. Security stepped out first. Then Mateus Carvalho emerged from the car. Camera flashes lit the morning air. Across Dallas, conversations about the Portuguese billionaire had already begun. Inside the convention center, the atmosphere carried quiet intensity. Large digital screens displayed maps of Texas energy networks. Construction models stood across the exhibition floor. Company representatives spoke with investors, while journalists moved between booths collecting statements. At the center of the event stood the main conference stage. Rows of chairs filled quickly as executives and officials took their seats. Mateus Carvalho entered through a private hallway reserved for keynote speakers. His presence shifted the energy in the room almost immediately. People stood to greet him. Some had traveled across the country for this meeting. Others hoped to secure partnerships with his company. Texas had become one of the fastest-growing energy markets in the United States. Whoever led the next wave of development would influence the region for decades. Mateus shook hands with several state officials before stepping toward the stage. Rafael Duarte walked beside him, reviewing the schedule quietly. "First the keynote," Rafael said. "Then the investment panel. After that, we visit the construction sites." Mateus nodded. From the stage, the view stretched across hundreds of attendees. Investors, corporate leaders, government representatives. Every screen behind him displayed a large digital rendering of the proposed Texas infrastructure network. Energy facilities, transportation corridors, residential development zones, projects that would reshape several cities across the state. Mateus adjusted the microphone and looked across the room. "I came to Texas," he began, "because this state believes in building for the future." The audience listened carefully. Outside the convention center, the city continued its daily rhythm. Workers moved through construction sites. Traffic filled the streets. And across town, beneath a highway overpass, Amara Johnson folded her blanket and prepared for another day. Their worlds remained far apart. For now, applause filled the convention hall as Mateus Carvalho finished the opening portion of his speech. Large screens behind him displayed detailed project renderings. Solar fields stretched across wide Texas land. Transmission networks connected cities. New construction zones appeared beside expanding highways. The scale of the proposal impressed everyone in the room. Mateus continued with steady confidence. "Our goal is simple," he said. "Create systems that support growth while strengthening communities." Several investors leaned forward, studying the numbers displayed on the screens. The Texas project involved billions in long-term development, energy facilities, housing support zones near construction areas, infrastructure designed to support rapid population growth. For many companies in the audience, the opportunity felt enormous. After the keynote, Mateus stepped down from the stage to join a panel discussion with regional officials and industry leaders. Questions began immediately. How many jobs will the project create? Which cities will receive the first construction phase? What role will local companies play in development? Mateus answered each carefully. Transparency mattered during investments of this size. Across the hall, a large exhibition section displayed scale models of the upcoming projects. Glass cases held miniature versions of planned buildings and energy systems. One display attracted particular attention: a community housing model designed to support workers and families near new infrastructure zones. Small homes arranged around shared green spaces. Affordable, efficient, practical. Mateus paused beside the display, studying the design closely. "Who developed this concept?" he asked one of the event coordinators. The man checked the presentation file. "It came from an independent consultant group," he said, "focused on affordable housing models." Mateus nodded slowly. He believed strongly that development projects must support communities, not only profit. Somewhere across Dallas, a woman once studied designs like this every day. But neither of them knew yet that their paths were slowly moving closer. By early afternoon, the conference floor had turned into a busy network of meetings. Executives moved between private rooms. Investors gathered around project displays. Journalists continued reporting from the edges of the hall. Mateus Carvalho stepped away from the main stage area with Rafael Duarte and two regional partners. Their next discussion focused on the construction timeline. A large digital map of Texas filled the wall screen inside the meeting room. Several cities were marked with colored indicators showing future development phases. "Dallas will serve as the first operational base," Rafael explained. He pointed toward a highlighted zone near the city center. "This district will support logistics, worker housing, and supply distribution." Another partner added, "The housing model presented this morning fits well with that plan." Mateus listened carefully. "Affordable housing near construction zones reduces long travel distances," he said. "Workers remain closer to their families." The group studied the proposal together. For Mateus, development had always meant more than buildings. Strong communities created stronger economies. After the meeting ended, he walked toward the large windows overlooking downtown Dallas. From this height, the skyline appeared powerful and modern. Towers stretched toward the sky, while traffic flowed steadily through the streets below. Somewhere within that city lived thousands of people who would be affected by the project he was planning. Construction workers, local businesses, families searching for stable homes. Mateus believed progress should reach every level of society. Yet at that same moment, several miles away beneath a highway bridge, Amara Johnson stood in line outside a food truck distributing free meals. The distance between their worlds remained vast. One man discussing billion-dollar investments, one woman focused on finding her next meal. But the city of Dallas was not as large as it seemed. Soon, their paths would begin moving toward the same place. Late afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass towers of downtown Dallas as the conference slowly came to an end. Inside the convention center, staff members began dismantling displays while journalists completed their final interviews. Mateus Carvalho walked through the exhibition hall one last time. Several investors approached him for brief conversations. Business cards exchanged hands. Future meetings were scheduled. Outside the building, the motorcade waited near the entrance. Rafael Duarte reviewed the next step on the day's schedule. "The construction district visit is ready," Rafael said. "The city arranged a site tour for you before sunset." Mateus nodded. He preferred seeing projects directly, rather than studying them only through presentations. Minutes later, the motorcade pulled away from the convention center and moved toward the western side of Dallas. The vehicles passed busy intersections and crowded sidewalks before turning into a growing development district filled with cranes and unfinished structures. Construction workers moved across the site while engineers reviewed equipment deliveries. Mateus stepped out of the vehicle and studied the landscape. Steel frameworks rose toward the sky. Concrete foundations stretched across several city blocks. This land would soon become the central hub for the Texas Infrastructure Project. Nearby stood several temporary buildings used for planning and logistics. One engineer approached with blueprints in hand. "Welcome to the Dallas site, Mr. Carvalho," he said. "We're preparing the first phase of development." Mateus walked toward the edge of the property and looked out across the surrounding neighborhood. A few streets away, old buildings and small shelters lined the road. Beyond them stood the distant highway overpass where dozens of people slept each night. Among them lived a woman named Amara Johnson. Neither of them knew it yet. But very soon, this construction site would bring their lives into the same moment. Morning heat rose quickly over the construction district west of downtown Dallas. Cranes stretched high above the skyline while trucks moved slowly through the fenced work zone. The sound of metal tools and heavy engines filled the air as workers prepared for another long day. Across the street, Amara Johnson stood near the corner of a sidewalk. Her backpack rested against her shoulder. Dust from the construction site drifted through the warm Texas air. She had heard about the project 2 days earlier. A massive development site, hundreds of workers, temporary labor needed for deliveries, cleanup, and basic site support. Work meant money. Money meant survival. Amara stepped closer to the entrance gate, where several construction workers were already gathering for their shift. Most of them wore orange safety vests and hard hats. She waited until one supervisor walked past the gate. "Excuse me," Amara said politely. The man paused. "Yes, I'm looking for temporary work," she explained. "Loading supplies, organizing tools, anything you need." The supervisor looked at her backpack and worn shoes. "This site requires registered workers," he replied. "Insurance rules." Amara nodded. "I understand. I'm willing to do any task outside the main zone." Before the supervisor could answer, 2 security guards approached the gate. "Only authorized workers beyond this point," one guard said firmly. Several men in line stepped forward to show their badges. Amara stepped aside as they passed. She remained near the entrance, hoping another opportunity might appear. Behind the fence, cranes moved steel beams slowly into place, while engineers studied blueprints. This construction site represented billions of dollars in development. For Amara Johnson, it represented something far simpler. One chance to earn a few dollars and move forward another day. But something unexpected was about to happen at that gate. The sun climbed higher above Dallas, casting bright light across the construction district. Workers moved steadily through the site entrance, while security checked badges and delivery passes. Trucks lined up near the gate, waiting for clearance. Amara Johnson remained near the sidewalk. She watched carefully. Experience had taught her something simple. Opportunity often appeared in moments of disorder. A loud voice suddenly broke the steady rhythm of the site. One of the delivery trucks had been stopped by security near the entrance. "I've been waiting 30 minutes, the driver argued. "These materials need unloading now." The guard shook his head. "Your clearance code isn't showing in the system." Several workers gathered nearby, frustrated by the delay. The truck carried boxes of equipment needed for the morning shift. Amara studied the situation quietly. Then she stepped forward. "I can help unload while they fix the paperwork," she suggested calmly. The driver looked at her, surprised. "You're offering to carry this equipment?" "Yes." One of the guards frowned. "She's not registered." "I'm not asking to enter the restricted area," Amara explained. "Just unload the truck here." The workers waiting nearby exchanged glances. The driver shrugged. "At this point, I'll take the help." Moments later, Amara climbed onto the back of the truck. Heavy boxes lined the cargo space. Without hesitation, she began lifting them carefully and stacking them near the gate. The work was demanding, but she moved with steady focus. Several workers watched with curiosity. Most people passing the site saw only cranes and construction. But at that moment, something else caught attention. A woman with quiet determination carrying box after box under the Texas sun. And across the property, a black vehicle had just arrived at the main site entrance. The black vehicle rolled slowly through the construction entrance as workers continued moving equipment across the site. Dust rose from the ground beneath the tires. Inside the car sat Mateus Carvalho. Rafael Duarte pointed towards several sections of the project while speaking. "The first phase will focus on the logistics center," he explained. "Once that's completed, housing development begins nearby." Mateus listened while studying the site through the window. Steel frames stretched toward the sky. Construction crews moved between concrete foundations and supply trucks. The scale of the project looked exactly as he expected, but something unusual caught his attention near the entrance gate. A small crowd of workers had gathered beside one of the delivery trucks. Mateus leaned slightly forward. "Stop the car," he said calmly. The driver slowed the vehicle. Mateus stepped out, shielding his eyes briefly against the bright Texas sunlight. Nearby, Amara Johnson continued unloading boxes from the truck. Sweat ran along her forehead as she lifted another heavy container and placed it beside the growing stack. Several workers stood nearby watching. "You sure you're okay doing this?" one man asked her. I'm fine, Amara replied while catching her breath. Another worker laughed softly. She's doing more work than half the crew today. Mateus watched quietly from a distance. The woman clearly did not belong to the construction team. Her clothes were simple. Her backpack rested against the truck tire. Yet her movements showed discipline and determination. Box after box moved from the truck to the ground without hesitation. Mateus turned to Raphael. Why is that woman working without a badge? Raphael looked toward the scene. I'm not sure, he admitted. The question had barely left his mouth when security began moving toward the truck. 2 security guards approached the delivery truck with firm steps. One of them raised his voice. Stop right there. Amara paused while holding a box. She looked down from the truck bed as the guards moved closer. You cannot work inside this site without authorization, the guard said. I'm not inside the restricted area, Amara replied calmly. I'm helping unload the delivery. The driver spoke up from the ground. She's helping me clear the truck while the paperwork gets fixed. The guard shook his head. Rules are rules. Several workers nearby began murmuring. She's doing the work nobody wanted, one man said quietly. Let her finish, another added. But the guard remained firm. Step down from the truck. Amara carefully placed the box onto the stack and climbed down. Her movements stayed calm, though a small trace of embarrassment showed in her eyes. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, she said softly. At that moment, another voice spoke from behind the gathering crowd. It appears she was solving a problem. The workers turned. Mateus Carvalho had walked closer. Security immediately stepped aside. The construction supervisor straightened his posture. Mr. Carvalho, he said respectfully. Mateus looked toward the stacked equipment beside the truck. How long would that delivery have waited without help? He asked. The driver scratched his head. Probably another hour, sir. Mateus nodded once. Then his attention returned to Amara. For a brief second, their eyes met. Amara quickly lowered her gaze.
Weeks later, the work continues in Austin. Amara begins proving her skills and determination, but not everyone believes she belongs there.
Second, their eyes met. Amara quickly lowered her gaze. She had no idea who the man standing in front of her truly was. But Mateus noticed something unusual in that moment. Not fear, not desperation, determination, and that quiet strength made him curious. The workers near the truck grew quiet as Mateus Carvalho stepped closer. Dust drifted through the warm Dallas air while cranes continued moving steel beams above the construction site. Mateus studied the stacked equipment beside the truck, then looked back at Amara Johnson. You unloaded these boxes yourself? He asked. Amara nodded slightly. The driver needed help. Her voice remained steady, though she felt several pairs of eyes watching the conversation. Mateus glanced at the driver. How heavy are the crates? About 40 pounds each, the driver replied. Mateus looked back at the tall stack beside the truck. There were dozens. He turned toward Amara again. Why offer to help if you don't work here? Amara hesitated for a moment. I was hoping to find temporary work, she answered honestly. Any kind of work. The construction supervisor stepped forward. Mr. Carvalho, she doesn't have a registration badge. Mateus raised a hand slightly, stopping the explanation. His attention stayed on Amara. You carried every box without being asked twice, he said. Amara gave a small shrug. Work is work. For a moment, the billionaire remained silent. The Texas sun reflected across the construction equipment around them. Most people meeting him for the first time tried to impress him. This woman simply stood there, tired, but composed. Something about that caught his attention. Mateus turned toward the supervisor. Let her finish unloading the truck, he said calmly. The supervisor nodded. Yes, sir. Amara looked surprised. She had expected to be sent away. Instead, the man had just given permission for her to continue. Before stepping away, Mateus spoke again. After you're done, I would like to speak with you. Amara blinked in confusion. She still did not know who he was. But that single moment had just connected 2 very different lives. Do you believe chance meetings can change a life? Share your thoughts in the comments. The last crate touched the ground beside the truck as Amara Johnson wiped her hands against her worn jeans. The stack of boxes stood nearly as tall as the truck itself. Several workers nearby nodded with quiet respect. Appreciate the help, the driver said, handing her a bottle of water. Amara thanked him softly and stepped away from the unloading area. Across the construction yard, cranes moved slowly against the bright Texas sky. The man who had spoken earlier stood near a temporary office trailer. Mateus Carvalho watched as she approached. Up close, Amara noticed details she had missed before. The clean lines of his suit, the quiet authority surrounding him, the way workers stepped aside when he moved. She stopped a few feet away. "You wanted to speak with me," she said carefully. Mateus nodded and gestured toward the trailer. Inside, the small office space held a long table covered with construction blueprints. Hard hats and safety vests hung along the wall. Through the window, the Dallas skyline rose behind rows of cranes. Mateus closed the trailer door behind them. "What is your name?" he asked. "Amara Johnson." He repeated it once, committing the name to memory. "I watched you unload that truck," he said. "You worked without complaint." Amara shifted slightly. "I needed the work." Mateus leaned against the table where several site plans were spread out. "This project requires reliable people," he said. "Even small operations need organization." Amara remained quiet, unsure where the conversation was leading. Then Mateus spoke again. "I would like to offer you temporary work here." The words surprised her. Amara looked at the blueprints on the table, then back at the man standing across from her. Because offers like this rarely came without conditions, Amara Johnson stood quietly inside the office trailer. The offer still echoed in her mind. Temporary work here. She glanced toward the table covered with blueprints and site documents. Charts, schedules, and supply lists were spread across the surface. Mateus Carvalho watched her reaction carefully. "This is not complicated work," he explained. "Basic logistics support, tracking deliveries, helping organize supply records." Amara folded her arms slightly. "You don't know anything about me," she said. Mateus gave a calm nod. "That is true." The answer surprised her. Most people who offered help wanted immediate explanations. Instead, he continued speaking in the same measured tone. "But I do know what I observed this morning," he said. "You saw a problem and stepped forward to solve it." Amara lowered her eyes for a moment. Years earlier, that same instinct had defined her career. Now it was simply a survival habit. Mateus picked up one of the papers from the table. "This site receives dozens of supply deliveries each day," he said. "Sometimes paperwork becomes disorganized." He placed the document back down. "Someone who pays attention to detail could be useful here." Amara studied the blueprints quietly. Her eyes moved across the numbers printed along the edges of the pages. Measurements, material quantities, scheduling notes. Even after months away from that world, her mind still recognized the structure of construction planning. Mateus noticed the way she looked at the documents. "You understand these plans?" he asked. Amara hesitated before answering. A little. That small reply hid far more knowledge than she wanted to reveal. Because accepting help meant answering questions. And questions often led people into the parts of her life she preferred to keep private. Amara Johnson stood beside the table, studying the blueprints spread across the surface. Lines and measurements covered the pages. Supply routes, building foundations, and delivery schedules filled the margins with small printed notes. For a moment she forgot where she was. Her eyes followed the layout of the site. Material storage zones, equipment staging areas, worker access routes. Mateus Carvalho watched her closely. "You're reading those plans quickly," he said. Amara looked up immediately. A trace of embarrassment crossed her face. "I've seen construction layouts before," she replied carefully. Mateus folded his arms. "Where?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Amara hesitated. If she spoke honestly, the conversation would become complicated. If she stayed silent, the opportunity might disappear. "I worked in housing development once," she said finally. Mateus raised an eyebrow slightly. "Design?" "Planning support," she answered. Her voice carried quiet restraint. The billionaire stepped closer to the table and glanced again at the blueprint she had been studying. "This project includes community housing zones," he said. Amara's eyes moved toward a section of the map, showing small residential blocks near the construction district. She noticed the spacing immediately. The cost estimates, the transportation access. Her instincts began calculating improvements before she could stop herself. The delivery roads might create congestion, she said before thinking. Mateus looked at her. She realized what she had just done. A woman who arrived at the site asking for basic labor had suddenly critiqued a development layout. Amara lowered her gaze again. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "That wasn't my place." But Mateus did not look offended. Instead, his curiosity grew stronger, because the woman standing in front of him clearly knew far more than she was willing to admit. Mateus Carvalho rested both hands on the edge of the table and studied Amara Johnson carefully. Outside the office trailer, construction noise continued across the site. Engines hummed. Workers called to one another. Steel beams shifted slowly beneath the cranes. Inside the small room, the conversation had become much quieter. "You noticed the traffic issue immediately," Mateus said. Amara kept her eyes on the blueprints. "It's only a small observation. Small observations prevent expensive mistakes," Mateus replied. He stepped closer to the blueprint she had mentioned earlier. "The delivery road runs parallel to the equipment yard," he said. "You believe that will create congestion?" Amara hesitated again. Part of her wanted to stay silent. Another part of her mind had already begun analyzing the layout in detail. "If heavy trucks arrive during worker shift changes," she said slowly, "the access road may block both directions." Mateus nodded thoughtfully. He traced a finger along the printed roadway. "And your solution?" Amara pointed toward a secondary route near the edge of the property. A staging lane here would separate deliveries from worker traffic. The suggestion was simple, practical. Mateus studied the map again for several seconds. Then he looked back at her. "You said you worked in planning support," he said. Amara gave a small nod. "Years ago." The room grew quiet again. Mateus understood something important at that moment. The woman who had arrived looking for manual labor had once worked in development planning, possibly at a professional level, yet she now stood in worn clothing inside a temporary construction trailer, asking for basic work. The difference between those two realities raised many questions. Mateus spoke again. "My offer still stands," he said calmly. "Temporary work assisting with site logistics." Amara lifted her eyes. This time the choice in front of her felt much larger than a simple job. Amara Johnson looked through the trailer window. Beyond the glass, cranes towered above the construction site while workers moved between stacks of equipment. The skyline of Dallas stood in the distance, bright beneath the Texas sun. For a moment she said nothing. Mateus Carvalho waited patiently. Years of business negotiations had taught him something important. Silence often revealed more than pressure. Amara finally spoke. "This job. What exactly would I be doing?" Mateus gestured toward the table covered with documents. "Tracking deliveries, organizing supply records, helping supervisors verify incoming materials." He paused before adding another detail. "It is temporary work." Amara nodded slowly. Temporary. That meant no long explanations about her past, no complicated background checks, just work. But another concern remained in her mind. "You don't know if I can be trusted," she said. Mateus met her eyes calmly. "You showed honesty when you could have walked away with that delivery payment," he replied. "Instead, you stayed to finish the work." Amara thought about the long nights beneath the overpass, the uncertainty of each day, the constant search for the next meal. Then she looked again at the blueprints on the table. Part of her life had once belonged in places like this. Accepting the offer might open questions she was not ready to answer, but refusing meant returning to the streets with nothing changed. Mateus spoke once more. "You may take time to decide." Amara held her backpack strapped tightly in one hand. The choice stood directly in front of her. Trust a stranger with quiet authority, or walk away and remain invisible. She took a slow breath, because the decision she made in the next few seconds would shape everything that followed. 3 weeks later, the Texas highway stretched wide beneath the afternoon sun as a convoy of work trucks moved south from Dallas toward Austin. Dust followed the tires while open fields rolled past the windows. Inside one of the vehicles sat Amara Johnson. A bright orange safety vest rested over her shirt, and a construction clipboard lay across her lap. Pages filled with delivery records moved gently with the vibration of the truck. Across the front seat, the site supervisor checked directions. "We should reach the Austin expansion site in 20 minutes, he said. Amara nodded quietly. The temporary logistics role had started slowly, but day by day she proved something important. Reliability. She tracked supply deliveries carefully, organized paperwork that had once confused several supervisors, checked shipment counts before materials moved into the storage yards. No one had expected that level of focus from a woman who first arrived at the site asking for manual labor. Yet the work spoke for itself. The truck turned off the highway and followed a newly paved access road. Ahead, the Austin construction site came into view. Cranes rose above wide-open land. Steel beams stacked across the property while workers moved between equipment yards and planning trailers. This expansion would support the second phase of the Texas infrastructure project. New energy facilities, housing development for construction workers, distribution centers linking multiple cities. Amara stepped out of the truck and looked across the massive work zone. The Texas sun pressed down hard against the ground, but something inside her had begun to change. For the first time in months, she woke each morning with purpose. Work had returned, and with it, a small piece of the dignity she once carried every day. The Austin construction site moved with steady intensity under the afternoon sun. Engines roared as bulldozers leveled sections of land. Workers guided steel beams into place, while trucks delivered fresh loads of equipment. Amara Johnson stepped into the temporary logistics trailer and set her clipboard on the desk. Delivery schedules covered the walls. Stacks of supply forms waited to be processed. The site supervisor handed her another sheet. 3 shipments arriving within the next hour, he said. Concrete mix, electrical cables, and structural supports. Amara scanned the document quickly. 2 of those deliveries used the same entry gate, she replied. The supervisor paused. You're right. He looked toward the entrance cameras. If both trucks arrive together, they'll block the equipment lane. Amara picked up a marker and adjusted the arrival times on the board. We can stagger them, she said. The supervisor nodded with approval. Outside the trailer window, several workers moved crates across the yard, while cranes lifted beams toward new building frames. Amara stepped outside with the updated delivery schedule and spoke with the gate operator. Within minutes, the incoming trucks received new instructions. The first shipment entered smoothly. The second arrived 20 minutes later without disrupting the equipment lane. Small changes like this saved time across the entire project. Later that afternoon, Rafael Duarte arrived at the site. He reviewed the operations board and noticed the updated schedule. Who reorganized the delivery times? He asked. The supervisor pointed toward Amara across the yard. She did. Rafael watched her speaking with a truck driver while checking cargo documents. He recognized something immediately. This was no longer someone performing simple support work. Amara Johnson was quietly improving the entire logistics system. The afternoon heat over the Austin site became intense. Workers wiped sweat from their faces as equipment continued moving across the property. The ground vibrated slightly each time heavy machinery passed through the construction lanes. Near the supply yard, Amara Johnson checked another delivery sheet. 2 workers approached with a pallet of equipment. Where should these cables go? One of them asked. Amara looked at the document. Electrical storage tent, Section 3, she replied. The men nodded and pushed the pallet toward the marked zone. Moments later, Rafael Duarte stepped beside her. You organized the delivery schedule this morning, he said. Amara glanced up. Yes. It prevented a 2-hour delay, Rafael added. She gave a small shrug. I noticed the overlap. Rafael studied her for a moment. Most new workers spent weeks learning the site operations. Amara had understood them within days. Across the yard, another vehicle entered through the gate. The driver looked confused while holding a set of papers. Amara walked toward him. Which shipment are you delivering? She asked. Structural bolts, the driver replied. Amara checked the schedule quickly. That shipment is early, she said. The driver frowned. I left Dallas at dawn. Amara reviewed the entry log. Then she pointed toward a temporary storage area near the edge of the site. You can unload there, she explained. We'll move the materials to the main yard later. The driver smiled with relief. Thank you. Rafael watched the interaction quietly. Every action she took showed clear thinking and calm decision-making. Later that evening, he reported something interesting to Mateus Carvalho. The woman from the Dallas site, Rafael said. She's becoming essential to operations. The Texas sun slowly lowered behind the cranes at the Austin site. Long shadows stretched across the construction yard, while workers began closing equipment for the evening. Inside the logistics trailer, Amara Johnson finished reviewing the final delivery reports of the day. She stacked the paperwork neatly before placing it inside the storage binder. Across the room, two supervisors spoke quietly. She reorganized half the supply system, one said. The other nodded. And she's only been here a few weeks. Amara pretended not to hear the conversation. She focused on cleaning the desk and preparing the schedule board for the next morning. Outside the trailer, a black SUV arrived near the operations area. Mateus Carvalho stepped out. He had come to inspect the Austin expansion site before returning to Dallas. Rafael Duarte greeted him and began explaining the progress. Construction remains on schedule, Rafael said. Delivery operations improved this week. Mateus glanced across the yard. Improved how? Rafael pointed toward the logistics trailer. The woman you hired in Dallas reorganized the incoming shipment process. Mateus looked toward the building. Inside the window, he could see Amara moving papers across the desk. The billionaire walked closer. Through the glass, he watched her review another shipment log. Her movements were calm and efficient. No wasted motion, no confusion, just quiet focus. Rafael stood beside him. She's been working long hours, he added. Mateus studied the scene. The woman who once asked for basic labor now coordinated part of a major construction operation. Something about her determination continued to hold his attention, because he understood a simple truth. People did not develop skills like that overnight. Evening settled over the Austin construction site as the last trucks rolled out of the yard. The sky turned deep orange behind the cranes, and a quiet calm replaced the loud rhythm of the workday. Amara Johnson stepped outside the logistics trailer and stretched her shoulders. It had been another long day, but the work gave her something she had missed for a long time. Purpose. Across the yard, the black SUV remained parked near the operations area. Mateus Carvalho stood beside Rafael Duarte, reviewing the final site reports. Rafael spoke first. She reorganized most of the supply tracking system, he explained. Supervisors now check deliveries through her board. Before unloading, Mateus glanced toward the trailer. Have there been problems? None, Rafael replied. Mateus nodded slightly. From a distance, he watched Amara speaking with two workers near the storage yard. She pointed toward a row of equipment containers while reviewing a delivery sheet. The workers listened carefully. Then they followed her instructions without hesitation. Respect had begun to grow around her. But not everyone felt comfortable with the change. Near the edge of the yard, another supervisor crossed his arms while watching the scene. That woman arrived here with no credentials, he muttered quietly to another worker. And now everyone follows her instructions. The worker shrugged. She knows what she's doing. The supervisor remained unconvinced. Back near the trailer, Amara finished her final task and looked across the property. The Texas sunset spread across the skyline. For the first time in months, her future no longer felt completely uncertain. Yet across the site, questions had begun forming among some of the leadership team. Why did the billionaire trust her so quickly? And how long would that trust continue? 2 days later, Amara Johnson returned to Dallas. The city skyline rose tall against the clear morning sky as the truck-carrying site reports turned onto a wide downtown avenue. Glass towers reflected sunlight across the streets. Amara looked out the window quietly. It had been months since she entered the center of the city as anything other than someone passing through. Today felt different. The vehicle stopped outside a tall office building owned by Carvalho Development Group. Security doors opened as employees moved through the lobby with coffee cups and briefcases. Amara stepped inside carefully. The polished marble floors and bright interior lights reminded her of a world she once knew well. A receptionist greeted her politely. "Mr. Carvalho is expecting you." She directed Amara toward a private elevator. The ride upward felt quiet and long. When the doors opened, Rafael Duarte stood waiting. "Good morning, Amara," he said. She nodded. "Mr. Carvalho would like to speak with you." Rafael led her down a hallway lined with glass windows overlooking the Dallas skyline. The office at the end of the corridor stood larger than the others. Inside, Mateus Carvalho sat at a long desk covered with documents. Behind him, the wide window revealed a breathtaking view of the city below. Construction cranes moved slowly in the distance. Amara stepped inside. Mateus gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." She did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Amara noticed a folder resting on the desk. Inside it, a printed document lay beside a pen. Mateus finally looked up. "I asked you here to discuss your future with this company," he said. Amara Johnson sat quietly in the chair across from Mateus Carvalho's desk. The office felt calm and spacious. Sunlight entered through the wide glass window behind him, revealing the full stretch of the Dallas skyline. Far below, traffic moved between buildings, while construction cranes marked areas of new development. Mateus opened the folder resting on the desk. Inside lay several printed documents. Amara noticed charts, planning outlines, and one sheet that looked like a formal contract. "You've been working with our logistics team for several weeks," Mateus began. Amara nodded. "Yes, your supervisors report consistent results," he continued. "Supply delays reduced. Organization improved. Communication between teams stronger." Amara listened carefully. Compliments were unfamiliar after months spent surviving on the streets. Mateus leaned back slightly in his chair. "But logistics support is not where your strongest abilities belong." Amara's eyes lifted toward him. "You studied development planning," he said. She hesitated. "A long time ago." Mateus turned one of the documents toward her. "This company is launching a community development initiative connected to our Texas infrastructure project." Amara looked down at the paper. The page described a new program focused on housing support for workers and struggling families living near the construction zones. Affordable housing models, community resource centers, programs designed to help people rebuild stable lives. Her chest tightened slightly as she read the details, because the idea felt familiar, very familiar. Mateus spoke again. "I want you to help build this program." Amara looked up slowly. "You're offering me a position?" "Yes." Mateus slid the contract across the desk. "A permanent role." Amara Johnson stared at the document resting on the desk. The paper looked simple. A few pages, a printed title at the top. Community Development Coordinator. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the contract, but she did not pick it up yet. Mateus Carvalho watched her reaction without speaking. Outside the office window, the Dallas skyline stretched toward the horizon. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Finally, Amara spoke. "You don't know everything about my past," she said quietly. Mateus folded his hands. "That may be true," he replied, "but I know what I have seen." Amara looked down again at the contract. "I lost everything once," she admitted. The words carried weight. Months on the streets had taught her to guard her story carefully. Mateus listened. "You rebuilt part of this project's logistics system in less than a month," he said. "That tells me something about your abilities." Amara shook her head slightly. "Working at a construction site is not the same as leading a development program." Mateus stood and walked toward the window behind his desk. From there, he could see several construction cranes moving across the city. "Every building you see out there started with someone willing to step forward," he said. He turned back toward her. "The question is whether you still believe in your own ability to do that." Amara felt a quiet pressure inside her chest. Hope, fear, opportunity, all standing in front of her at once. Mateus returned to his seat. "You can walk away from this office and return to the life you know," he said calmly. "Or you can accept this position and help design housing that supports thousands of people." The contract remained on the desk between them, waiting. Amara Johnson looked down at the contract again. The printed words seemed clear. Permanent role, community development initiative, project leadership support. Everything on the page represented a life she once believed had disappeared forever. Her hands rested on her lap while her mind moved through memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Late nights reviewing housing proposals, meetings with investors discussing community development, excitement about building neighborhoods where people could live with stability. All of it had ended months ago when her life collapsed faster than she expected. Now a new opportunity sat on the desk in front of her. Mateus Carvalho watched quietly. He understood something important about moments like this. People who had lost everything often feared success even more than failure, because success meant stepping into the world again. Amara finally spoke. "If I accept this position," she said slowly, "people will ask questions about my past." Mateus nodded. "That is possible." She lifted her eyes toward him. "And if they learn I spent months living on the streets?" Mateus did not hesitate. "Then they will learn that you rebuilt your life." The answer surprised her. No judgment, no hesitation, just a simple statement. Amara looked toward the Dallas skyline outside the window. From this height, the city looked full of possibilities. But stepping into that world meant leaving behind the quiet invisibility she had lived with for months. Mateus pushed the pen slightly closer to her. "You don't need to decide immediately," he said, "but understand something." Amara looked back at him. "This opportunity will not remain open forever." The room fell silent again, because the decision sitting in front of her would determine the direction of her entire future. The contract remained on the desk between them. Amara Johnson stared at the page while the Dallas skyline shimmered through the glass windows behind Mateus Carvalho. For months she had lived day to day. Find food, find a safe place to sleep, stay unnoticed. Now one decision threatened to change everything. Her fingers slowly reached toward the paper, then they stopped. Fear pressed against her thoughts. Accepting the job meant stepping back into a world where people asked questions, where reputations mattered, where past failures could follow a person forever. Mateus remained silent, allowing her space to think. Finally, Amara spoke. "If I accept this," she said, "I won't pretend to be someone else." Mateus nodded calmly. "I wouldn't ask you to." She studied his face for a moment, searching for doubt. There was none. Just quiet certainty. Amara took the pen. Her hand hovered above the contract. A life beneath highway bridges, or a life helping build communities again. Two different futures, one single decision separating them. After a long breath, she lowered the pen to the page and signed her name. Amara Johnson. The moment the ink touched the paper, her future shifted. Mateus closed the folder slowly. "Welcome to the development team," he said. Amara leaned back in the chair, still absorbing the decision she had just made. Because she understood something clearly. Nothing about her life would remain the same after today. What would you choose if one decision could change your future? Share your answer below. 2 months later, the early morning sun warmed a quiet Dallas neighborhood, where several small houses stood surrounded by construction scaffolding. Workers carried tools between buildings while painters prepared fresh coats of white and soft blue along newly repaired walls. A large sign near the street read, "Community Housing Renewal Project." Amara Johnson stood beside a folding table reviewing a clipboard filled with renovation schedules. Unlike the busy construction zones she had worked in earlier, this place carried a different energy. Families lived here. Children ran across sidewalks while parents spoke with project coordinators about repairs and housing support. Amara looked across the street, where a group of volunteers unloaded boxes of supplies. Fresh bedding, kitchen equipment, basic furniture for families moving into the renovated homes. Mateus Carvalho's development program had launched quickly after she signed the contract, but the design of the program came directly from Amara's experience. Temporary housing support, affordable rental plans, community spaces where families could rebuild stability. A small girl ran past the table chasing a red ball across the pavement. Amara smiled as the child's mother called after her gently. Moments like this reminded her why she had once chosen housing development as a career. Homes created stability. Stability created opportunity. A construction supervisor approached the table. "Renovation on Maple Street finishes tomorrow," he said. Amara checked the schedule. "That means 3 families can move in this week." The supervisor nodded. Across the block, fresh paint covered walls that had once been cracked and worn. Amara looked down the street at the row of homes being repaired. Not long ago, she had slept beneath a highway bridge, wondering how to survive another night. Now she was helping build homes for families who needed a second chance. By midday, the neighborhood had grown lively. Contractors worked on roofing repairs, while volunteers arranged furniture inside one of the newly restored homes. Fresh grass had been planted along the sidewalks, giving the street a cleaner and brighter look. Amara Johnson walked between the houses with a folder tucked under her arm. 2 parents stood near a doorway speaking with one of the coordinators. "We haven't had stable housing in almost a year," the the father said quietly. Amara approached and introduced herself. My name is Amara. I help oversee the housing program. The couple looked surprised but relieved. She listened carefully as they explained their situation. Job loss had forced them out of their apartment months earlier. Since then, they had moved between relatives while trying to rebuild their finances. Amara nodded with understanding. You're not alone, she said gently. Many families face situations like this. She guided them through the housing application process, step by step. The father studied her face for a moment. You speak like someone who understands this struggle, he said. Amara paused briefly. I do, she answered honestly. That small admission created immediate trust. Across the yard, children played near a swing set that volunteers had just installed. Laughter filled the space where abandoned houses once stood empty. Amara watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. Programs like this worked best when the people leading them understood the reality families faced. Her past had once felt like a burden. Now it had become her greatest strength. A volunteer approached holding a clipboard. Local media called earlier, he said. They want to visit the project next week. Amara looked surprised. She had focused entirely on the work itself. But the progress happening in this neighborhood had begun attracting attention. The following week, the neighborhood looked even more transformed. Fresh paint covered the houses along Maple Street. New fences lined the sidewalks, and a small playground had been installed near the corner park. Children laughed as they climbed across the equipment while parents spoke nearby. Amara Johnson stood with several volunteers beside a folding table where new residents signed final paperwork for their homes. The first family stepped forward. The father held the keys carefully in his hand. You have no idea what this means to us, he said. Amara smiled. I think I do. She guided them through the final orientation process. Maintenance contacts, rental agreements, and community meeting schedules were all explained step by step. Everything had been designed to help families stay stable long term. Across the street, several construction workers finished installing a row of garden beds where residents could grow vegetables. The goal of the program had never been only about housing. It was about rebuilding the community. Mateus Carvalho arrived later that afternoon. His car stopped near the entrance of the neighborhood, where a small sign displayed the project name. He walked slowly through the street, observing the progress. Children played near the sidewalks. Families carried boxes into their new homes. Volunteers organized supplies near the community center. Mateus stopped beside Amara as she reviewed the next renovation schedule. You've done impressive work here, he said. Amara looked around the street. We did it together, she replied. Mateus nodded, but he understood something important. The project had gained its direction from her leadership. Just then, a camera crew stepped out of a van parked near the entrance. Local reporters had arrived. The camera crew walked slowly down Maple Street, adjusting equipment as they prepared to record. A reporter stood near the entrance sign while the cameraman tested the lighting against the afternoon sun. Several volunteers noticed them immediately. Media is here, one worker said quietly. Amara Johnson looked toward the street. She had expected a short visit, but seeing the cameras still made her slightly uneasy. Mateus Carvalho stood beside her. This project deserves attention, he said calmly. The reporter approached with a friendly smile. Good afternoon, she said. We're covering community redevelopment projects across Dallas. She looked down the street where families moved furniture into freshly repaired homes. This neighborhood changed quickly. Amara nodded. The goal was to move fast so families could settle in before the next school term. The reporter turned to the cameraman. Let's record here. Within minutes, the camera light switched on. Children continued playing nearby, while volunteers carried supplies across the yard. The reporter began speaking. This neighborhood once faced severe housing challenges, she explained to the camera. Today, it looks completely different. She turned toward Amara, and much of the coordination came from this program's development team. Amara hesitated slightly before answering. Our focus is helping families rebuild stability, she said. Behind the camera, several residents listened with quiet gratitude. One mother stepped forward holding her young son's hand. She helped us get this home, the woman said. The reporter's interest grew immediately. Moments like that made strong news stories. The camera continued recording as the conversation moved across the street. Across Dallas, The story of the housing project had begun reaching more people. The camera crew remained in the neighborhood until late afternoon. They filmed children playing near the new homes, volunteers working beside construction crews, families carrying boxes into living rooms that smelled of fresh paint. Amara Johnson moved carefully through the activity, answering questions while making sure the work continued smoothly. For her, the attention felt unfamiliar. Her focus had always been the families, not the cameras. The reporter finished recording one final segment near the entrance sign. "This Dallas neighborhood shows how thoughtful development can change lives," she said into the microphone. And much of the organization behind this effort came from a woman who understands housing challenges from personal experience. The camera shut off, but the impact of the visit had already begun. Later that evening, a short news clip aired on local television. Images of the renovated homes appeared on the screen. Families smiled while standing on their new front porches. Then the reporter's voice continued. Community Development Coordinator Amara Johnson helped guide this project from the early stages. Inside the Carvalho Development Office downtown, several employees watched the broadcast. Rafael Duarte leaned back in his chair. "She's becoming well known quickly," he said. Mateus Carvalho nodded quietly. Recognition had started earlier than he expected. Back in the neighborhood, Amara walked slowly down the street as the sun began to set. Children's laughter echoed across the sidewalks. Lights turned on inside homes where families prepared dinner. But something new had entered her life. Attention. Across the city, more people had begun asking a simple question. Who is Amara Johnson? And soon, the answer would begin reaching far beyond Dallas. Night settled over downtown Dallas as bright streetlights reflected across the pavement. Traffic moved steadily through the city center while restaurants and small shops prepared for the evening rush. Several blocks away from the business district, volunteers gathered beneath a large freeway overpass. Tables were being set up along the sidewalk. Boxes of blankets, hygiene kits, and food containers were stacked neatly beside them. A banner hung between two metal poles. Housing Support Initiative Launch. Amara Johnson stood near the entrance of the event area, holding a clipboard as volunteers prepared the space. The familiar concrete structure above her stretched wide across the road, the same place she once slept. For a moment, she remained silent while watching the activity around her. Several volunteers unloaded folding chairs. Others organized registration forms for people seeking housing support through the new program. Mateus Carvalho's foundation had decided to expand the redevelopment effort. This time the focus reached directly into the areas where many people lived without shelter. Amara walked slowly across the sidewalk, checking the preparation list. "Food station ready?" she asked. A volunteer nodded. "Supplies arrived an hour ago." She moved toward the registration table where two staff members prepared information packets. Each folder contained details about temporary housing, job placement assistance, and long-term development support. Programs designed to help people rebuild stability. Amara looked up toward the overpass above. Months earlier, she had slept beneath that concrete structure with a small backpack beside her. Now she returned to the same place with a different purpose: to help others step away from the life she once struggled to escape. The evening air beneath the Dallas overpass filled with quiet movement. Word had spread quickly through nearby streets. People began arriving slowly. Some carried small bags filled with their belongings. Others walked in groups, curious about the event taking place beneath the bridge. Volunteers greeted each person with calm voices and warm food. Amara Johnson stood near the registration table watching the line grow longer. The faces passing before her looked familiar. Tired eyes, careful movements, people who had learned how to survive one day at a time. A man stepped forward holding a worn backpack. "Is this where we ask about housing help?" he said. "Yes," Amara answered gently. She handed him a registration form and explained the program. Temporary shelter placements, job training support, connections to the new housing projects being built across Dallas. The man listened carefully. "You mean actual apartments?" he asked. "Eventually," Amara replied. "But we begin with stability first." He nodded slowly and moved toward the information table. Nearby, volunteers served hot meals while children sat on folding chairs eating quietly beside their parents. Amara walked further beneath the overpass. Her footsteps slowed when she reached the far concrete pillar. The same place where she once spread a thin blanket across the ground. The memory returned clearly. Cold nights, uncertain mornings, endless waiting for opportunity. She placed one hand against the pillar and looked across the gathering crowd. Tonight, she stood on the other side of that experience, not as someone seeking help, but as someone helping others. Yet deep inside, she understood something important. Leaving the streets behind did not erase the memory of living there. As darkness deepened across downtown Dallas, the event beneath the overpass grew busier. Volunteers moved quickly between the tables, handing out blankets and directing people toward the registration area. Soft lights hung from portable stands, illuminating the gathering beneath the concrete structure. Amara Johnson walked slowly along the line of visitors. Many faces looked worn from long nights outdoors, yet the atmosphere held a quiet sense of hope. A woman holding a small child approached the table. "Someone told me this program helps families find housing," she said carefully. Amara nodded. "That's exactly what we're here for." She guided the woman toward the information desk and explained the support process step by step. Nearby, another volunteer helped an older man complete his paperwork. Across the space, a group of young volunteers prepared warm meals for the next wave of arrivals. Mateus Carvalho arrived a short time later. His car stopped along the curb while security maintained a respectful distance from the crowd. Mateus stepped out and looked across the scene. Hundreds of people had gathered beneath the overpass. Tables filled with supplies stretched along the sidewalk. Children sat beside their parents eating, while volunteers continued working steadily. Mateus walked toward Amara. "You organized all of this," he said quietly. Amara looked around the space. "Many people helped," she replied. Mateus nodded. But he understood something clearly. The strength of the program came from someone who had lived through the same struggle. Across the street, a few reporters had begun setting up cameras again. The growing crowd had attracted attention throughout the city. Tonight's event was becoming larger than anyone expected. The crowd beneath the overpass continued growing as more people arrived from nearby streets. Volunteers worked steadily at each station. Food tables remained busy. Registration forms filled quickly. Portable lights cast bright circles across the pavement, while traffic passed overhead along the freeway. Amara Johnson walked beside Mateus Carvalho toward the far side of the event area. The familiar concrete pillar stood there. She paused briefly. Mateus noticed the moment. "You stayed here before," he said quietly. Amara nodded. "For several months." Mateus looked up at the wide structure above them. The sound of vehicles passing overhead echoed through the night air. "It must feel strange returning here now," he said. Amara studied the space where blankets once covered the ground. "It reminds me why this program matters," she replied. Nearby, volunteers began preparing the final registration group of the evening. More than 100 people had already signed up for housing assistance. Several families would receive temporary placements within days. Across the street, camera crews recorded the event from different angles. The story had spread across local news channels. People across Dallas were now watching the housing initiative unfold in real time. Amara moved back toward the main table to help process another group of forms. Suddenly, a young volunteer approached her quickly. "Amara," he said, slightly out of breath. "What is it?" "The medical tent needs help." Amara looked toward the corner of the event space, where volunteers had set up a small health station. A crowd had gathered there. Someone appeared to be in trouble. Without hesitation, Amara began moving toward the area. Because moments later, the night would shift in a way no one expected. Amara Johnson moved quickly through the crowd toward the small medical station. Several volunteers stood around a folding table, where a nurse had been checking basic health conditions for visitors. Now the group looked tense. "What happened?" Amara asked. One volunteer stepped aside. "A man fainted while waiting in line," he said. The nurse knelt beside the man, checking his pulse while another volunteer brought water. Amara crouched nearby to help. "Has he eaten today?" she asked. The nurse shook her head. "Not for a while, it seems." Moments like this reminded Amara how fragile life on the streets could become. Basic health problems often went untreated for months. The man slowly regained consciousness. Volunteers helped him sit upright, while offering food and water. Relief passed through the small crowd. Amara stood again, taking a slow breath. The evening had already helped dozens of people, but the reality of street life remained difficult. She turned back toward the main area of the event. Portable lights reflected across the pavement, while volunteers continued assisting families. Across the street, reporters still recorded footage. The housing initiative had become one of the most talked about community programs in Dallas. Mateus Carvalho walked toward her again. "You've changed many lives tonight," he said quietly. Amara looked across the overpass. Hundreds of people had gathered. Some would leave with new housing opportunities. Others would return tomorrow for support. For Amara, the moment felt powerful. Because this same place had once been her lowest point, now it had become the starting point for many others. But as the night continued, exhaustion slowly began catching up with her. And before the event ended, something unexpected would happen. Something that would lead directly back to the night outside the Dallas hospital. The night beneath the Dallas overpass continued long after the first families received their housing support forms. Portable lights illuminated the event area while volunteers worked steadily beside the registration tables. Amara Johnson moved between the stations with quiet determination. Her clipboard filled with notes, names of families, emergency placements, follow-up appointments for housing interviews. The program had grown larger than anyone expected. Mateus Carvalho watched the activity from across the street. Hundreds of people had passed through the event already. Many left with hope they had not felt in months. But Amara had barely rested since the event began. She helped organize supplies, answered questions from families, coordinated with volunteers and health workers. Her focus never slowed. "Has she eaten today?" Rafael Duarte asked quietly. Mateus shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure." Across the crowd, Amara stepped away from the registration table and walked toward the sidewalk. Her steps felt heavier now. The long weeks of work building the housing program had pushed her far beyond exhaustion. Still, she kept moving. Because every person waiting in line reminded her of the life.
Everything leads back to this moment, a night of hope, a city watching. What happens next will change everything.
Still, she kept moving. Because every person waiting in line reminded her of the life she once lived. As she crossed the street toward the hospital entrance nearby, rain began falling lightly across the pavement. Reporters stood outside the hospital canopy, preparing to record closing coverage of the event. Amara reached the edge of the entrance lights. Her vision blurred slightly. The sounds of the crowd faded into the distance. She took one more step forward. Then the strength left her legs, and in the middle of the rain-soaked sidewalk, Amara Johnson collapsed. The same moment that had opened this story. For a moment, confusion spread across the hospital entrance. Rain fell steadily while reporters lowered their microphones in surprise. One of the volunteers from the event shouted first. Someone collapsed. Security guards rushed forward from the curb, while two nurses standing near the emergency doors reacted immediately. Amara Johnson lay on the pavement, barely conscious. Her clipboard had fallen beside her, pages scattered across the wet sidewalk. One nurse knelt quickly. "Pulse is weak," she said. Another signaled toward the hospital doors. "Bring a stretcher." The reporters stepped back as medical staff moved through the crowd. Within seconds, Amara was lifted carefully onto the stretcher and rushed through the emergency entrance. The hospital doors closed behind them. Outside, the sudden moment had already captured attention. Camera lights flashed across the rain. "Was that Amara Johnson?" one reporter asked. "From the housing initiative?" Across the street, Mateus Carvalho had already begun moving toward the hospital. Rafael Duarte followed close behind. "She pushed herself too hard tonight," Rafael said quietly. Mateus did not answer. His focus stayed on the emergency doors ahead. Inside the hospital, nurses guided the stretcher down the hallway while doctors prepared the examination room. The exhaustion from weeks of work had finally caught up with her. But something else mattered now. The entire city had just witnessed the woman behind the housing initiative collapse outside the hospital entrance. News crews remained outside under the rain, their cameras still recording, because the story that began beneath a Dallas overpass had now reached its most important moment. Inside the hospital examination room, doctors worked quickly around the stretcher. Bright lights filled the space while medical monitors tracked Amara Johnson's condition. A nurse checked her blood pressure while another prepared a bag of fluids. "Severe exhaustion," the doctor said, after reviewing the initial readings. Dehydration, as well. The long weeks of work organizing the housing initiative had pushed her body too far. Outside the room, Mateus Carvalho waited in the hallway with Rafael Duarte. Several volunteers from the event had also arrived, standing quietly along the wall. The atmosphere remained tense. Minutes later, the doctor stepped out. "She will recover," he said. Her body simply reached its limit. Mateus nodded with visible relief. "Can we see her?" In a few minutes, the doctor returned to the room. Mateus looked down the hallway toward the hospital entrance where reporters still gathered outside. The story of the housing program had already spread through local media. Now another moment had captured attention, the woman behind the initiative collapsing after helping hundreds of people in one night. Soon the hospital door opened again. "Mr. Carvalho," the nurse said. "You may come in." Mateus stepped into the room. Amara lay resting beneath a light blanket while the four-line delivered fluids. Her eyes opened slowly as she noticed him standing beside the bed. "You stayed," she said quietly. Mateus gave a small nod. "Of course." Amara glanced toward the window where the rain still touched the glass. "I didn't want the event to stop," she whispered. Mateus leaned slightly closer. "It didn't," he replied. Because outside the hospital, volunteers had continued helping families long into the night. The next afternoon, sunlight filled the hospital room. Rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the Dallas skyline bright against the blue Texas sky. Amara Johnson sat upright in the bed, slowly finishing a glass of water while a nurse checked her vitals. "Your body needed rest," the nurse said gently. "You pushed yourself too far." Amara nodded with a small smile. Sometimes, important work moves faster than the body can keep up. Across the room, Mateus Carvalho stood near the window speaking quietly with Rafael Duarte. The news coverage from the previous night had spread quickly. Clips of the housing event appeared across television stations and social media. Images of volunteers helping families beneath the overpass. Scenes of the renovated homes across Dallas. And footage of Amara collapsing after hours of organizing support for people living on the streets. Mateus turned toward her. "People across the city are talking about the program today," he said. Amara looked surprised. "That wasn't the goal." Mateus nodded. "I know." He stepped closer to the bed and placed a tablet on the table beside her. On the screen played a short news segment. The reporter spoke confidently. "Community development leader Amara Johnson has become the face of a housing initiative changing lives across Dallas." Images of families moving into renovated homes followed the report. The segment ended with a simple message. More housing programs would soon expand into other Texas cities. Amara looked up slowly. "You're expanding the program?" Mateus smiled slightly. Across Texas, Amara sat quietly for a moment. The work she began had now grown far beyond a single neighborhood. Soon the program would reach thousands of families across the state. 3 months later, the sun lowered slowly across the Dallas skyline, casting warm light across a newly completed housing community on the edge of the city. Rows of fresh homes stood along quiet streets. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, while families gathered near a small community park built at the center of the neighborhood. A stage had been set up near the entrance sign. Community Housing Initiative Expansion. Residents, volunteers, and city officials gathered to celebrate the opening of the newest housing development, funded by Carvalho Foundation. Amara Johnson stood near the stage, looking across the neighborhood. The transformation still amazed her. Months earlier she had slept beneath an overpass wondering how to survive another night. Now she helped guide a program changing housing access across Texas. Mateus Carvalho joined her beside the stage. "You should be the one speaking today," he said. Amara smiled softly. "We built this together." Moments later she stepped to the microphone. The crowd grew quiet. Amara looked across the families standing before her. Many had once faced the same uncertainty she lived through. "Everyone deserves the chance to rebuild," she said. Her voice carried calm strength. "Sometimes life brings difficult chapters, but those chapters do not define the entire story." Applause rose across the neighborhood. The program continued expanding across cities throughout Texas. New housing projects, job training centers, communities designed to support families starting over. As the sun set across the skyline, Amara stepped down from the stage. Her journey from the streets to leadership had come full circle. Have you ever rebuilt your life after a difficult chapter? Share your story and subscribe for more American storytelling.